What was the most chaotic period in Clash Royale history? Some may claim it to be the October 2022 meta. Others may claim it to be the period after The Little Prince was released in November 2023, when it was the single most used card in challenges ever. Evolutions on release, especially with the Firecracker, could also be a solid contender. But I don't think any of these eras, or any period for that matter, compare to the chaotic season that was known as Season 4, October 2019. There's been plenty of periods in Clash Royale history where one card shines far above the others, causing their usage to skyrocket, changing the landscape of the meta. But October 2019 was a season where not one, not two, but 6 cards were so broken that it ended up creating one of the most unbalanced, unfair, chaotic seasons in Clash Royale history, in which no other season has ever compared, and likely never will. The events of this season permanently changed the way Supercell approached balance changes going forward. So many events led up to this season being what it was that it seems impossible that it was all a coincidence. So today, we're going to talk about all of the events that led up to Season 4, and the long-lasting impact this season had on Clash Royale. So now, let's begin by going over the events leading up to the October 2019 season. We're actually going to start all the way back in February 2019. This season saw the release of a brand new card, the Wallbreakers. For 3 elixir, they would charge at the tower, dealing 1 burst of damage before dying. But if they were unsupported, only one of them would actually make it. At Tournament Standard, or level 9, this was 400 damage. But then you just compare it to the modern day Wallbreakers. The Wallbreakers today are only 2 elixir, and they will both connect if left by themselves. Nowadays, they only deal 325 damage at level 9, but since both will connect, that's a total of 650 damage. So not only do you get more damage for less elixir, but you have more freedom to play them, like being able to split 1 on each side. It really paints the picture on just how truly bad this card was upon release. Arguably, it was the worst a card has ever been upon launch. Seth, the community manager, actually had tweeted about this, stating that having new cards come out too strong was an overall negative, so the team was purposely releasing cards underpowered to minimize the chance of said card disrupting the metagame. In recent years before this, you saw broken card releases with the Night Witch, Royal Ghost, and Royal Recruits. It not only made the game incredibly frustrating, especially because not everyone could access the card yet, but also came off as a scummy move by Supercell. When a card was released overpowered, it encouraged players to spend money to level it up quickly to get a huge advantage over those who have it at a lower level or maybe not even at all. And then the card would inevitably get nerfed, disappointing those who spent a lot of money to get it maxed out. Whether they were releasing them overpowered on purpose or not, a lot of players hated the incentive it created. If the card is released underpowered, players have time to level it up so they can start using it on an even playing field when it's inevitably buffed into viability. It was just a matter of time now, and of course, we'll get to that later. Next up, we're going to jump to Season 1, July 2019, the first season where they started numbering seasons. This month would see the release of the new Fisherman card, and this card followed in the trend of new cards being underwhelming. Today, this troop is only 3 elixir, but on release, it was 4. And despite it costing more to play in 2019, the modern day 3 elixir one has a faster hit speed and longer range. So knowing that, it's no surprise that the Fisherman was underwhelming upon release. It wasn't quite as bad as Wallbreakers, but you certainly weren't seeing him appear in any top decks. There really isn't much else to say until Season 3, September 2019, where the Fisherman would receive a rework. His elixir cost was reduced from 4 to 3, with his damage being decreased by 11% to compensate. This was a huge change. An elixir reduction makes a world of difference when it comes to strengthening a card, making even the worst cards insanely overpowered without proper stat reductions. An 11% damage nerf was a very small price to pay for an elixir cost decrease. Since the card was already vastly underperforming, this may seem like the right move, but time would tell the true impact of a rework like this. This wasn't the only major rework to happen this month though. The Fisherman changes would practically slide under the radar, getting little attention from the community, because one more major rework took all the spotlight. The one for none other than the Executioner. he would get a massive damage increase, almost double what he had before, in exchange for less range, a slower attack, and less health. It sounds fair in concept, but preview gameplay exemplified the terrifying potential of this new Executioner. Players were going nuts, panicking at this change, fearing that the Executioner would be ruling the game very soon. Seth addressed this by saying he actually feared the Executioner being too strong just as much as the players, but reassuring that the win rates in testing were actually on the lower end, and they would enact an emergency change if the card was too problematic. This rework was actually the start of a series of reworks that were planned to be implemented to long-term underused cards. Cards in cases where a simple buff would make the game unhealthy in some way, even if the card was statistically balanced. Seth asked the players what cards should have been reworked, and popular suggestions from the community included all of the 5 Elixir long-range splash cards, so it looked like it was finally starting in September with the Executioner. Despite Seth's words of reassurance that the card was statistically likely not going to be broken, and even if it was, it would be nerfed quickly, people were still freaking out. It was probably the most freaked out the community ever was towards a balance change. So in response to this, Supercell did something that they usually don't do. They caved. At the last minute, just before the balance changes were set to go live, Supercell walked back some of the buffs Executioner was supposed to get. Now, instead of a 98% damage buff, it was only 82%, meaning a lot of the new beneficial interactions like being able to take out barbarians in one throw was no more, which was kind of the whole point. The minimum to maximum range was also supposed to be toned down to 3.5 to 5 tiles. Now that was nerfed even further down to just 3 tiles with a projectile range of 4.5 tiles. This was even less than the baby dragon. The axe return time was also decreased from its expected 1.1 seconds down to 1 second. This might sound better, and it is in the sense that the second tick of damage would occur sooner, but since the hit speed was remaining at 2.5 seconds, it meant the card would have even less area control. This was just contributing to an ongoing major disaster. Admitting that a card rework had low win rates in testing, but still caving to community pressure, nerfing it an insane amount before players even had a chance to test it. Not only was this dumb because it practically guaranteed the card was going to be in an incredibly unhealthy state, but also because this happened so last minute. A lot of players logged in thinking the Executioner was going to be a certain way, not knowing it was changed last minute. So, when they hopped into a battle with him, they got something completely different from what they were expecting. Unsurprisingly, when this rework went live, the card was in an even worse position than before, all while the Fisherman, who had been sliding under the radar due to all the focus on Executioner, started rapidly rising in popularity. So now Executioner players were disappointed, and you had the broken Fisherman disrupting the game. And mind you, all of this came after a massive P.E.K.K.A rework and Goblin Cage buff from the 2 previous seasons, which ended up making those cards game-breaking, only getting fixed right as these Fisherman and Executioner reworks were going live. So it just went from one messy meta to another. Unhappy with this, both the Executioner and Fisherman would receive an unscheduled balance change just 3 days after the Season 3 balance changes went live. Executioner's damage would be increased by 2%, so it could kill a flying machine in one throw, and its range was increased by a full tile, which is a big buff, but it definitely needed a lot of help, and this was actually a longer range than it was originally supposed to get. The Fisherman simply got a health nerf of 5%, so that it would now die to lightning. It was a fairly small nerf considering how popular it was, but this is how an emergency nerf should be done. After these changes, Fisherman would remain as the most used card throughout Season 3, while Executioner's rates rose to be among the levels of an average card. But despite this card getting reworked and last-minute changes 3 times within a 3-day period, players were very unhappy with how it was. Despite the average rates, players believed the Executioner was way too strong, and in a vacuum, it seemed to be stronger than a typical card should be. The main thing appearing to hold it back was the Fisherman. The overpowered Fisherman kept the Executioner in check. Since it was appearing in about 40% of decks for the entirety of the season, chances are you'd be going against it 4 times for every 10 battles you played, making it hard to win consistently if you were playing Executioner. Some more adjusting to these cards was very necessary, but with the last-minute adjustment on top of the emergency change, doing anything but waiting until the next scheduled set of balance changes would seem completely over the top. People were already tired of how many times Executioner was changed, so it was best not to overdo it. So now, we finally made it. With all the relevant events covered, we now arrive at October 2019, Season 4. The season that took an already unstable environment and made it exponentially more chaotic, introducing perhaps the worst set of balance changes in the game's history. Firstly, Executioner was completely absent, which many saw to be a mistake, especially because the Fisherman would be getting nerfed. And as we already acknowledged, Fisherman was the main reason Executioner wasn't showing its full potential, but maybe it wouldn't be so bad, because the Fisherman nerf was incredibly light, so it was still going to be extremely popular going into the new season. Next up, the Wallbreakers. Remember them? By now, they had been out for over 8 months, and they had received some buffs up to this point, but it was never enough, so this month, Supercell was determined to get them into the meta. Their elixir cost was reduced from 3 to 2. But it seems like Supercell didn't learn their lesson from the Fisherman, because the stat nerfs to compensate were very minor. Their damage was only decreased by 10%. But this wasn't even all, because they also got a mass increase, meaning they would push through troops easier to reach the tower faster. They also got a small collision radius increase, which made them a little easier to defend, but it really didn't make much of a difference. Next up is one of the biggest reworks a card has ever received. Supercell was continuing to give massive reworks to long-term underused cards, which were all of the 5 elixir long-range splash cards. And now, it was the Witch's turn. Like the Executioner, she would get a massive damage increase, more than triple what she had before. Ultimately, the goal was to make her less like a wizard and more like a musketeer. To compensate, she would spawn skeletons slower, lose 12% of her hit points, have her splash radius reduced by more than 50%, and lose all of her death skeletons. It's really hard to find a stat they didn't change in this rework. And the final balance change we need to note here is the Night Witch, whose death bats would be increased from 2 to 4, which seems like one of the more reasonable balance changes since the Night Witch had been considered the worst legendary for a while up to this point. And the buff was decent, but not over the top. So why would I bring this change up when trying to highlight the craziness of this season? Any other season before this, most players probably would have generally agreed that this was a good change. And even in this case, it wasn't the change itself that was considered to be bad, but rather the timing of it. This balance change would go down historically as one of the worstly timed balance changes in Clash Royale history, because only days after the balance changes went live, a new win condition, the Elixir Golem, was released. This card had similar stats to the Golem, an 8 elixir card for just 3 elixir. The catch being that once it died, it gave 4 elixir to the opponent. Since it functioned so similar to Golem, and because the Night Witch historically had always worked exceptionally well in Golem decks, it was no surprise the two cards instantly began seeing a lot of use together. And the Elixir Golem wasn't some average card. It was meta-defining upon its release, breaking the trend of underwhelming card releases. So you had the Fisherman Executioner feud barely changing from Season 3, the Wallbreakers and Witch, who were both very underwhelming for a while, getting massive reworks, and finally the newly buffed Night Witch paired with the new broken win condition. All cards on their own respective journeys, experiencing high, if not their highest points, all at the same time. This was the recipe for a disastrous season. Now, there's other cards I could mention that arguably deserve some recognition, like Baby Dragon, Log, or Miner, but I don't feel like these cards were strong meta drivers like the 6 I previously mentioned. At least, they were cards that had almost always been strong, so emphasizing their strength during this chaotic season would feel misleading. But out of all the cards this season, which one was truly the strongest? Well, in terms of usage, the Witch easily had the biggest jump in popularity. For the entirety of the season, it was being used in around half of challenge decks, which at the time was some of the highest rates a card had had in grand challenges ever. It was only being beaten by the Poison, which was only popular to counter Witches. Fisherman was still used in around 1/3 to 40% of decks. Wallbreakers went from unused to appearing in about a quarter of decks, while both the Night Witch and Elixir Golem were in around 1/3 of decks. Fisherman was still helping to keep the Executioner in check, so the rates were still around what they were the previous season, and although still strong in a vacuum, the environment did not allow him to thrive as much as he potentially could. For some perspective, as of the Elixir Golem release, there were 95 cards in Clash Royale. If every card had equal usage, that would average out to about 8.4%. so most of the cards I mentioned were at least 3 to 4 times the target threshold. The Elixir Golem paired with Night Witch, and sometimes Witch as well, was the dominant structure you would see. You always had to be prepared for those 3 cards. Other types of beatdown were boxed out thanks to the Elixir Golem because it was better than other ground tanks in just about every way. Elixir Golem allowed the player to easily build really big pushes. If you set it up right, there was really nothing the opponent could do. The 4 elixir it gave to the opponent did matter a lot, but not if they lost their tower before seeing any of it. That was really the biggest issue. Especially when it was paired with an overpowered Witch and Night Witch, it was a nightmare to go against. If you weren't using Elixir Golem with Witches, you had to have Poison or Bomb Tower. Both cards had huge spikes in usage because they were really your only shot against E-Golem Witch decks. Decks utilizing these cards would be crafted along with the overpowered Wallbreakers to thrive in an environment that would otherwise be completely ruled by beatdown. From this point on, Miner and Wallbreakers would be known as an iconic combo. But even with that combo being really strong, there really just wasn't a non-E-Golem deck that didn't include Bomb Tower and or Poison. Except for maybe a couple ex-NATO ones. But even the ex-NATO combo would need support from cards like Valkyrie and Mega Knight, cards that were tanky and splashy. Fisherman was often seen in both Elixir Golem beatdown and Miner control. He could be seen in either archetype pretty frequently. He was also seen a lot in Graveyard, which was another popular archetype this season. With Baby Dragon being so strong, and with Graveyard decks always having the poison even before it was in super high demand, and with the Graveyard archetype already being a good natural counter to beatdown decks, this was another viable alternative if neither of the other 2 archetypes were your style. Knowing everything I've told you, it's understandable why players were calling for emergency nerfs. It seemed like a no-brainer. Maybe not for all 6, but Witch, Elixir Golem, and Fisherman definitely seemed in clear need of at least a small emergency nerf. I don't think anyone would have argued against that, especially because the Elixir Golem actually wasn't officially out yet. It was just obtainable early by getting a certain number of wins in a special challenge. If you failed to get 8 wins in a challenge or just missed it, you couldn't even play the Elixir Golem until the next season. Not even allowing everyone to have access to the most overpowered win condition was cruel. Despite the meta devolving into the biggest mess the game's ever seen, Drew, another community manager, confirmed there would be no emergency changes. Normally in a circumstance like this, some emergency changes would be inevitable. But due to the chaos in Season 3 Supercell caused by overreacting with Executioner, they decided to take a relaxed approach. If this season had not just come after this disastrous balancing cycle, this period of chaos would likely not have lasted more than a few days. This is yet another reason why Season 4 just stood out so much. At least with the Broken Phoenix meta, there were emergency changes within days. They didn't just let it ride out for an entire season. It's so stupid anyway because the main problem with the Season 3 approach was that they never let the original rework go live. So acting on that as an emergency is obviously going to have wild effects. This wasn't the case in Season 4. They went through with the original changes and let them settle. Having a broken card release, bad reworks, not nerfing known overpowered cards enough, and a badly timed buff, all during a period where emergency changes were out of the question, is a feat so rare it's insane to think this is even real. Supercell clearly learned a lot from this season, which is why there will never again be a season like Season 4. So what was Supercell's next move? Season 5 was coming fast, and there was a lot of work that needed to be done. 5 of the 6 main cards I focused on were getting attention in the November balance changes, and there wouldn't be any more major reworks. It was time for damage control. These changes worked out better for some cards than it did for others, and the biggest victim of these balance changes was easily the Witch, which wasn't a huge surprise considering she was the most popular. She got a hit speed increase of 0.3 of a second, had her first wave of skeletons delayed by an additional 2.5 seconds, and had her splash damage completely removed. Yes, removed. She was no longer a 5 elixir long-ranged splash card, but rather a 5 elixir long-ranged card. It's no surprise that the Witch was close to being in the worst state a card has ever been in after these changes. The nerfs were way overboard. The Elixir Golem, Fisherman, and Wallbreakers all got more proper nerfs. They all required some more adjusting later, but they ended up being okay for the most part. The Night Witch was really the one card that slid under the radar. She had very high rates, but most people just believed her strength to be tied to Elixir Golem, so when that card fizzled out, the Night Witch was expected to follow suit. Even at this point, it was commonly agreed that the buff itself wasn't bad, but rather the timing of it. However, it would continue to remain very popular for months even as the Elixir Golem started to phase out. So in January of the following year, they finally gave it a nerf. The Executioner, on the other hand, was not getting a nerf, but rather another rework. It received a projectile range increase in exchange for an area damage radius decrease. The hover time of the axe was increased without increasing the hit speed though, so it created a longer area of denial. This rework really seemed more like a buff, whether that was the intention or not. On top of this rework though, the Fisherman was nerfed and out of the meta for the first time since the initial Executioner rework, so he could no longer hold it back. I'm not really sure whether the Fisherman nerf or Executioner rework helped it more, perhaps it was a bit of both. Regardless, Executioner soon became the most popular troop in Clash Royale for Season 5, taking over as the new main meta driver. The game's meta just hadn't experienced any sense of normalcy for months by now, and players were getting increasingly tired and frustrated. All of this would lead to one final set of emergency changes. On November 21st, 2019, Supercell would do something they rarely ever do: apologize. They straight up acknowledged the chaos they created and apologized for it. They regretted pushing the Executioner and Witch reworks when they did, and admitted power area damage ranged attackers did not lead to fun or interesting metas. When balancing a game like this, it makes sense why ideally you'd think it'd be best for every card to be statistically balanced. But they explain in this article that if area attackers like Executioner are statistically the same as other more high-skilled cards, it lowers the scale cap of the game overall by making these defensive plays just a feature of a card that is otherwise viable in a multitude of one-on-one situations. And on top of that, they say that they should not fundamentally change the function of cards, because even if the card was unpopular and losing a lot in competitive play, there are always going to be casual players that enjoy the card at a lower level and become disappointed when a card that played a specific role in their deck doesn't do so anymore, especially for a card like the Witch, because she's always been a popular ladder card. So it definitely upset a lot of players when they made her so bad after the failed Season 4 rework. Imagine being free to play in casual, investing months worth of resources into her, just to have her become completely useless even in a casual environment. Now, the team wasn't going to completely stop doing reworks entirely, but they were definitely going to be more cautious and thoughtful when applying them in the future. And in the meantime, Executioner and Witch would be reverted back closer to their pre-September or October 2019 states, and planned reworks for cards like Bomber, Bowler, and Wizard would be temporarily halted. Supercell also kinda gave up on releasing cards purposely underpowered, because not only did it prevent people from getting excited about new cards, but it wasn't even preventing disruptions to the meta, only delaying them. This still left a major issue, because all of these cards were not in a healthy state. There's a reason they were getting or were planned to get reworks. So what was the next step then? Well, it varied for each card. Bowler and Bomber did eventually get reworked, settling to be in pretty healthy positions. The Executioner and Witch both got small buffs in the preceding years, and while Executioner ended up in a fairly healthy spot, the Witch has never really seen any competitive play again. And finally, the Wizard. Although he was planned to get a rework in 2019, he has yet to ever receive a balance change since this period. And he has consistently, since competitive play was introduced, had terrible rates in competitive play. He's never been considered competitively viable, and his last balance change was in June 2018. Almost 6 years ago today. The main reason Supercell has been so hesitant is simply because Wizard is still fairly popular in lower ladder. Funny enough though, Seth did actually confirm a Wizard buff would eventually come, back in 2019.
Once a card like Wizard gets into that rut where they're not really strong and they're only seen when they're over-leveled, there's a huge perception problem with buffing those cards. Now we will eventually buff him.
So either they're really taking their sweet time with this buff, or Season 4 drastically altered the paths of several cards even to this very day. This is partially why there's just been several cards that have been terrible for years that Supercell doesn't even attempt to fix. Many players don't remember, but the dev team was adamant on trying to make every card at least somewhat viable back in the day. If a card had trash use and win rates long enough, they would at least attempt to buff or rework it in some way. In recent years, we just haven't seen that strive. It makes sense to give a card a rest for a little while if an attempted rework fails and ends up causing a messy environment, but letting cards rot indefinitely is pretty sad, because it's almost the same as them just being removed completely. At least it seems like evolutions over time will give a new breath of life to all of these long-term underused cards. If you want to learn more in depth about the cards I mentioned in this video, or other cards, check out the playlist I linked below. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you later.